welcome to our featured author segment for June. I love, Bryn, that you were actually like, Barb and I are always saying like, we always do this while the theme's playing. And I saw you do a little bounce there. So that was kind of fun.
It's a very jazzy theme song. I love it.
Right? That's Barb. Barb picked that. That was just the funniest thing. She's so sorry she's not here today. She's actually, so both of us were in Texas last week for the Historical Novel Society conference. And we got back on, well, she actually got back Sunday night, and then she did all of her laundry on Monday and packed because Tuesday she's on sort of a dream trip to Iceland. So she was, I know. I did that trip last year, and then she's like, okay, so now we're going. But she was really sorry to miss it because she loved the book. So for everyone joining us, I'm Donna Jones-Allward. I'm one of the co-hosts of Step Into the Story, and today I'm joined by Bryn Turnbull, who has a new book out.
Yay.
So thanks for stopping in.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I mean, it's so nice to chat with you. It's so nice to chat with you. And I mean, I have to say, I completely understand, Barb. Iceland, amazing. I'm dying to go there. So
you haven't gone. So my husband and I went last year, and we had such a good time. And it was the first time we'd taken a vacation in like almost 2 decades. Like, it was crazy.
Oh gosh, so well-deserved vacation then.
Yeah. And so we went, and when Barb was planning it, I'm like, well, here's the tour company we use, because we did a self-drive.
Yeah.
And it turns out, I didn't even realize, but they're using the same one. So, so hopefully it's good for them. I don't want to be at fault for anything. But her loss is my gain, because I'm so excited to have you here. Last year, we did The Last Grand Duchess as one of our book chats at the beginning of the month, and we loved it so much. And so when we saw you had a new one out, and it's no secret, I'm a huge fan of World War II. So I was like, this is happening. So yeah, so the new book is The Paris Deception. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So The Paris Deception, it's a story of art theft and forgery in Nazi-occupied Europe. And it chronicles the exploits of 2 main characters, Sophie and Fabienne, who are sisters-in-law at serious odds, as they team up to save works of art that have been looted from Jewish families by the Nazis. They band together to save these works of art from falling into Nazi hands by replacing the originals with clever forgeries. And it centers specifically around one style of artwork that the Nazis deemed degenerate. So degenerate art is basically modern art, non-representational art, so Cubism, modernism. The names of these art are all names that everybody knows: Picasso, Braque, Dali, Kirchner, Cezanne, all of these artists that we love, Van Gogh, another one. Most were deemed degenerate by the Nazis, and they wanted to eradicate this modern art from the world. And so Sophie and Fabienne realized what's happening, and Sophie, being a young art restorer who is operating within the museum where the Nazis take all the art that they are looting, she takes it upon herself to take these paintings out and replace them with these forgeries. But when the degenerate collection catches the eye of Hermann Göring's handpicked art dealer, Konrad Richter, their task becomes much more difficult.
Right. So I found this to be a real departure from your last book, which of course was, it's the Russian Revolution, which is very different from, the world of World War II art forgery. And then your previous book before that was The Woman Before Wallace, which again, that goes back to, now we're in England, and we're looking at the Wallace Simpson story and Edward and whatnot. So what led you to choose this as your topic for that book?
Well, I feel, I have always loved World War II fiction and World War II history. Like, I think I have been kind of fascinated by the Second World War since I was about in the 6th grade. And so I knew I wanted to write a World War II book. But so there are so many great novels about the Second World War, and there are so many great novels about Second World War resistance. And so with this story, I wanted to look at resistance in a bit of a different way, because, you know, in occupied France and in occupied Europe at large, not everybody could take up arms, right? Not everybody could go to the woods and join the resistance. You know, some people had children, people had, you know, they had lives that they couldn't just leave behind. And so with this story, that was what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to focus on, what does resistance look like for those who are not formally enlisting in the resistance? And I ended up coming across the story of this degenerate art through my kind of exploratory phase when I was trying to figure out what to write about. And I also came across the real life art forger named Han van Meegeren, who was a Dutch forger who sold a fake Vermeer to Hermann Göring. And he ended up being kind of, I know, but he ended up being I know, good for him. But he ended up being arraigned by a war tribunal at the end of the war because people thought that it was a real Vermeer and that he'd actually sold a priceless Göring. And so he ended up in a courtroom and he had to paint it again for, you know, in front of an audience. He had to paint this painting a second time. And so,
oh wow.
Yeah. And so I kind of thought, okay, well, that's an interesting angle. Art forgery, the art world, how can I build a story of resistance centered in that world? And then, of course, I came across the Jeu de Paume, and which was this museum where the Nazis took all this looted art, and the story kind of, it kind of fell into place. But it was a very different process from the first book, because for the first two books, rather, because this is the first book where I'm not writing purely historical figures, right? This is the first book where I have two fictional main characters. And so that was a whole different process of sort of creativity for me, which I really loved kind of having the opportunity to do.
I was gonna say, easier or harder or just different?
I don't know. Well, I mean, I think because I've done two books where the main characters were historical, that had become familiar to me. I can't say easy because it's not. Right. But certainly familiar to me. Like I kind of knew the sandbox that I was playing in. You know, it's, you take it and you're like, well, we know that she had these friends and these lovers, and she was at the, you know, in these places, and this is, you know, we have all those facts. Right. And you kind of build around that central scaffolding. Whereas with this book, not having that scaffolding, not having those facts as kind of the building blocks to work with, you end up having to figure out, I almost found it was more of a process of reverse engineering, because I would have these characters and go, okay, well, I want them to be in this room at this time, and I want them to do this. And then I'd have to think, okay, well, why are they doing that? What brought them to that room in the first place? What about their past impels them currently? How does that propel them forward? What are their childhood traumas? What's their family structure? All of that stuff had to be built kind of out of where I wanted the character to go. I had to figure out the past in that whole process. So that was certainly a challenge. And that's two characters.
And I'm the opposite, because I tend to like to do that, and and build your own scaffolding, because I find if someone else has the scaffolding for me, then I don't like working within it. But it is a very different process. And so that makes total sense. And when you were talking about, you know, what does resistance look like when it's not, you know, you're in the woods resistance fighter kind of thing. My daughter has a saying, I don't know where she picked it up, but I'm sure she did somewhere, but she talks about a concept called malicious compliance. And so it's, you know, and I think of that with Sophie, right? Like, she's going along and she's doing what they think, you know, they think she's doing the job that they've tasked her with. And she's compliant with that. I mean, she is doing that, but she's also doing something else that is going against their objectives, but doing it quietly and not overtly. And it's like this malicious compliance thing.
Oh, I love that.
And I think that I just thought of that term where it's like, you know, I'll do it, but I don't have to like it. And underneath it, it's not going to be like, this isn't working in your favor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Well, sort of the power of the law as opposed to the spirit of the law, right?
right. And I love the line that you had in there about when Fabienne says to her family about the law and how in a time of war, you know, it's not necessarily the law, but like moral law as opposed to real law. And that was a great line. I gotta say, I'm totally in awe of your research because I went back to your website. I thought, okay, I knew you'd studied a lot, and I thought I'm going to go back and see what she studied, because there's got to be an art history degree in here somewhere or something, and there wasn't. And there's just so much rich detail and into not just the art world, but also champagne making. Like it was not just one profession that you tackled, but two. But you wove everything in so naturally that it never felt like we were given a lecture on how to mix paints or how to restore a painting or what happens when you have to turn the bottles. And I was just in awe of that. So what can you say about your research process? Because it was just brilliantly done.
Thank you so much. I love doing the research. That is my favorite part of the book, is just diving into a particular time period, particular profession. And in this case, I kind of backed myself into a corner a little bit with Sophie, because it was, okay, well, she's going to work within the Jeu de Paume, and that's how she has all this, ability to get close to these paintings. And then you have to go, okay, well, what profession would she have that would allow her to do that? Because if it was something unspecialized, she would have not been kept on. So I landed on the idea of art restoration. Now we call them art conservators, right. But landed on this idea of an art restorer who would be working in that museum. And one of the things that I find so wonderful and such a privilege about this job is you can have conversations with people, and when you tell them that you are writing a book about XYZ, people are so generous with their own knowledge. And in this book, I was having a conversation with one of my old roommates from university. I was telling her about, the fact that I was going to make this character an art restorer. And she goes, "Oh, I have a friend from high school. She's a conservator in New York. Do you want me to put you in touch with her?" And I literally was like booking a plane ticket, like within 5 minutes, going, "Yeah, please." And I ended up, through that woman, getting a connection to an art conservators at the Met, MoMA, and the Museum of Natural History. And so I was able to spend a day with these art conservators who walked me through what art conservation was. Like, I got to tour their labs and ask about all the different kind of implements and materials that they had. And also the thing that I found really particularly interesting, because in historical fiction, I'm writing about a character who has a job that still exists today, but the methods of doing that job and the philosophy of that job have completely changed. And so being able to talk to them about sort of the evolution of art conservation and how, in the 1940s, the job would have been make it look pretty, fix the holes. And now it's look at the piece as an entirety, look at its provenance, look at its history, acknowledge what's happened to it. It's a very different philosophy. And so being able to kind of position Sophie at the forefront of what we now consider art conservation as opposed to restoration allowed me to kind of gain a nuance on this character that I absolutely would not have gotten otherwise, which is incredible. I actually also met with an art forger while I was writing this book, who talked to me about how they would go about forging artwork, which was, again, incredibly valuable because I have no idea how to do that. So, right. Yeah. So really, really cool.
That sounds like what a research trip, right?
It was incredible.
And then the way that you wove it in was because it's so easy for when you're showing research to have it feel like a lecture in whatever that topic is, or for it to be very, very telly versus showy. But like you really did weave the details in, so it just flowed with the story, and it felt intimate without being overdone.
Thank you.
So well done. Did you go through the same process with champagne making, or I mean, it had a smaller role.
It had a, yeah.
But...
I mean, I will say that I did do a research trip to France, and for that research trip, for you, my readers, I went to Champagne and I drank champagne and I did tours of all the champagne facilities for you, my readers. This is, you know,
what a sacrifice.
What a sacrifice.
I have never been.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I mean, Champagne had such an interesting history during the war. You know, it was a hotbed of resistance activity. Yes. And all of these real stories. And I was able to kind of touch on a couple of them in this book. Robert Jean de Vogue, who was the head of Mouet et Chandon, also headed up the regional resistance movement, which fascinating. Francois Tattinger, same thing. He was a resistance operative. And so I loved being able to kind of thread in those real life people a little bit in this fictional story.
I love when you can do that. Also, so one of the founding members of Step Into the Story is Renee Ryan. Mm-hmm. And her first book that she released as strictly historical fiction was The Widows of Champagne. And it's 3 generations of women in a family running a vineyard not far from Reims, and part of the resistance and that whole thing. So if you're like, it's so well done. So when I was reading it, I'm like, I know about that. It was just really, really well done. And what an interesting piece of resistance in France. So another thing I want to touch on, because this was very interesting to me, is that it's very clear that Sophie and Gerhardt are homosexuals, in that Sophie, it's very, very early on, we see Sophie, and she kind of has a crush on her friend Greta. Yes. But it's very downplayed. And we see with Gerhardt too, that he had a partner named Willie. But that part of their lives, you touched on it, but you didn't make it a big part. And I wondered if you were tempted to make it a bigger part of the story, why you chose to keep it smaller. And then I have another thought after you answer that question, unless you already answer it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with Sophie, for those who haven't read the book, Sophie has got an incredibly traumatic past. She grew up in Germany in Stuttgart, and was kind of coerced into joining the Bunde Deutsche, I'm going to muck up the pronunciation, but Bunde Deutsche Model, which was the girl version of the Hitler Youth.
Right.
And we have a flashback scene where we see her in that phase of her life, which is where Greta comes along. And we're also meeting her after the death of her beloved brother. And so for me, looking at that character, sexuality is such an important part of a person, but it's also not the be all and end all.
Right.
And so for this character, where she was in her life, having had, these past traumas, and I referenced the fact that she was getting to the point where she was interested in someone else, and there was somebody else who was maybe going to come into her life, and then Dietrich dies, and all of that kind of falls out the window, because that's just not the place where her head was.
Right.
And I mean, I think that's just, that's kind of what happens sometimes. Right. And on top of that, at this point, being gay was a crime. And so living openly was not something one could do. So that's the other aspect. Nothing has happened with this, but I know where Sophie's story is going to move forward in my head. And so I'm hoping I can revisit her life and revisit her love stories moving forward. but with both Sophie and Gerhardt, one of the reasons why I wanted to include, representation, queer representation in this book is because I talk about the notion of degenerate art and what the Nazis considered to be degenerate art. And there's a very clear, very horrible line that runs from the Nazi notion of degenerate art to the Nazi notion of degenerate people. And so it was important to me that my main characters represented different aspects of what the Nazis would have considered degenerate, and to show their heroism and to show their humanity in spite of what the Nazis would think. So, we've got queer characters, we've got Jewish characters, we've got political radicals and dissidents. And so it was important for me to kind of be able to present those different facets of what is so threatening about this, right?
Right. And that was exactly where I was going with it. Was that I got thinking after that you look at Gerhardt and Sophie, and they're working on this and the degenerate art, and they themselves would have been classified as degenerate if their sexual orientation had been known. Yeah. And so I thought that was just a really neat parallel that you made. So that was where I was going with it. Yeah. I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't read it yet, but I kind of wondered at the end if maybe Sophie's future included Rose. So I don't know if that's where your mind has gone, but mine certainly went there, especially when we see how the book ends and how everything is resolved. And I got to tell you, as we're getting closer to the end, there were things that happened in there that I did not see coming.
Good.
Yeah. That were actually lovely. And some of them were just small things, but I was like, oh, I didn't, but it made perfect sense. Like I could look back and see where you'd set it up. So there's a scene where Sebastian sees her going up the stairs, sees Fabienne going up the stairs, and you kind of wonder why he reacts so firmly, but why he's so reactive about it. But then, as you go on, you realize why. And so, but just little things that, you don't know why at the time, but when it happens, you look back and you go, oh, she did set it up in there. So it was a lovely, lovely read, and a very nice addition to my World War II stack, because I hear all the time, World War II is not selling as much, or World War II is not. And then I'm like, as long as people are writing it, I'm going to read it. I just love it. I'll always love it.
There's so many stories to tell, and there's so many different facets of what that war was and what it meant to so many different people, right? And we've heard so many stories, but there are always going to be stories to tell about this time period, and there's always going to be
people who want to read them. I think is the important thing.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I love it. So thank you so much, because that was just it was instructional, but it was also like it just kept me turning the pages and kind of got me swept up into the characters, and it was purely enjoyable. So
thank you.
All right. So we're going to move on just very quickly, because we want to know, what are you working on now?
Yes, I'm working on novel number 4. And it is about, I'm moving forward in history. You'd think I would be like, I've done so much research in this time period, I'm going to stay there. No, I keep jumping around the historical record. And so I'm going into 1960s Germany. And the book is about a couple that gets separated by the construction of the Berlin Wall.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's very, very different. This is the first book where I'm going to have a male protagonist as well as a female protagonist, which is has been a very interesting writing experience. And lots of very, very, very fascinating history in that time period that I was not as familiar with. And so it's been really fascinating learning about East and West Germany and everything that was going on in that time.
It's funny, because at the conference last week, one of the things that Barb and I both said we enjoyed so much was it didn't matter who you sat with. you'd ask about what they wrote, or something would come up, and we just nerded out over history that we didn't know. Like there was always someone talking about something that we were like, oh my God, really? And then we, and so I love that whole learning aspect. I'm in the research phase myself, and it's so much fun. It's kind of hard to like stop and then realize you have to actually start writing the book.
That's the trouble, is I could happily stay researching forever. And I get to the point where I'm going, okay, no, I actually have to like put words down on the page now.
Right. It's kind of like when you're in school and you think, oh, I could be a career student, but you don't make any money at that.
I honestly think that's why I became an author, because like I love school so much, and this is like very school adjacent.
Right.
So it's a little bookworm.
I agree. I feel like, especially the last couple of years, because I'm making the pivot over to historical fiction after.
Okay, so what are you researching? What's your time period?
Titanic. But with a Canadian twist, because the bodies that were retrieved were brought to Halifax.
Yes.
The survivors were taken to New York. And so there, it's sort of a 3-point story. So we have, the boat, and then we have New York, and we have Halifax, and then how it all converges. And so I know. So I'm having a really great time, and I really want to take a trip to New York for the Titanic exhibit that's there, but I'm not sure I'm going to make it before it closes. So maybe I'll just have to go to Belfast.
You know what? I think maybe that would just be too darn bad.
Well, like we said earlier, sacrifices have to be made.
Exactly. I have to drink champagne. You have to go to Belfast,
Right? Like, all in service to the story.
The things we do for our books.
I know. It's been a joy having you here. Thank you so much for stopping in.
Oh, the pleasure is entirely mine, Donna. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right. So next week on Step Into the Story, Barb and I will be talking. Actually, we've been doing a series for a book in a year kind of thing in our writing room. And we're taking June off because we're going to talk about all the wonderful things about the Historical Novel Society Conference. And so we'll be talking about some of the things we learned, some of the things we're looking forward to, some of the books that we brought home. I was carry-on only, so I had to be very, very judicious. Our writing room is going to be all things conference, and I think it's going to be a really fun show. So that is on the 27th, I think, at 7 p.m. And Barb and I will be chatting then. So until next time, thank you so much for joining me today, Bryn.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.